What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the Counting Wisdom podcast. I usually try to make podcasts just in between my videos, just because sometimes I'm in a place where I can sort of easily make a podcast, but it's not necessarily the best place to make a video. Especially if I want to try to put out more of a higher quality type video. I try to make a just an audio only version until I get to a place where I can make a better video. So anyway, in this particular podcast, I wanted to talk about what appears to be sometimes how God pays us later in life. Now, as I continue in this, particular podcast, I do want to note that, I believe there are blessings that we can receive here in this earth. I believe God, every day rights wrongs, that, take place. I think God does administer justice, in a lot of different realms of what happens in this earth, but I think there are some cases where, we have to wait until heaven to, really receive, the full blessing of God, especially when you get into matters of, not experiencing pain or suffering. Not experiencing anything that is, sad or sorrowful. And so, one of the things that I notice sometimes is that, when I think about, God sort of repaying me, sometimes I know I can sometimes feel like, no, I don't want to necessarily wait, for this to happen. I want God to sort of, pay my kind of blessing right now in a way. But I think when talking about God repaying you, I think one thing to note is that we do have to qualify, if you want to use the word qualify, for God's blessing as far as, one, going to heaven. We know that it's not necessarily based off of what we do, but we do have to have faith in Jesus Christ. So that's the preliminary, or I guess a prerequisite in order to make it to heaven. And so that's what definitely, of course, all people should have that faith in Jesus Christ, but that's what you need in order to even make it to heaven. But then, the Bible seems to describe, rewards based off of the things that we do, based off of, certain choices that we may make, based off of the good or bad that we do. We can either receive a reward or not receive a reward. And so I think it's important to, realize that, sometimes it appears that, especially when analyzing maybe all of what happens in a Christian's life, and many different Christians' lives, that you sometimes get paid back for things rather than, having an, upfront blessing or payment, so to speak, right from the start. When you think about maybe some Christians being martyred, or having something wrong happen to them, there are some cases where you cannot necessarily get repaid until God deals with it. Especially let's say somehow you're killed, in some form or fashion, murdered in some way. Obviously, you would have to wait until heaven to get paid back. But even, in some way, when you look at Revelation, the martyrs who are under the altar in heaven, God tells to sort of wait for a little while until they will receive justice for the wrong that was done to them. And I don't think it necessarily, obviously, when you get to heaven, I think, regardless of how you get there, so to speak, I feel like, obviously I don't know, but I feel like it's sort of a blessing in of itself to, get to heaven, irregardless of if you're murdered or in a car accident or, you die of old age or something. But, in some form or fashion, this Revelation passage sort of shows these martyrs under the altar, wanting the people on earth to be paid back for the wrong that they do. And so I think in this particular reference in the Bible, it's sort of mentioning how, like, if that person who killed you is still alive on this earth, then, the martyrs that are in heaven, they're sort of like, hey, when is something going to be done? These guys that are still living on this earth are, just getting away with what they did. Now, one thing to note, though, is that once that person dies, for example, when Hitler dies, as far as we know in regards to, evil and, a person that is like, the description of Hitler, that person goes to hell. And so they receive, their punishment, immediately once they die. And so I think that, especially the reference in Revelation is sort of talking for that particular time period when their murderers, the criminals, were still alive on the earth, and God was at least telling them that they had to wait a little bit longer until they, receive justice. And so I think, I just thought of how sometimes I think we sort of have to, be okay with, God working in the future for these things. I think this not only applies to maybe being paid back for a wrong, but, obviously, we live in a day and time where, we weren't born in the Garden of Eden. We weren't born in heaven. And so, obviously, just being alive on this earth comes with different challenges, different things that we face. Even a fairly normal day can sort of have you experiencing just some discomfort, as far as maybe anxiety or worry. Now, I know the Bible does sort of give some reference to maybe some people who don't necessarily experience the same things that other people do. I know Jesus mentioned that, the rich have, gotten their comfort here on this earth. And so, the Bible does mention that, in reference to the rich. But, I think that, it really just depends on what we are talking about, because I know there's a passage in the book of Proverbs that says that, the righteous will be recompensed here on the earth. And so it implies that, if you are righteous, part of your reward can start coming to you while you are here on this earth. But, in other cases, the Bible does sort of give reference to, something being paid back to you later in a future time. When you look at the story of Joseph, I think the story of Joseph shows, a blessing coming to him while he was here on this earth. You know, Joseph was thrown into prison, for one, being falsely accused, but then he was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery by his brothers. And so it seemed like, Joseph, had problems from his brothers, but he also had problems from an outside source not related to his brothers, someone completely different, and he also found trouble in that way. And so, one, Joseph could have, died, so to speak, and, never really saw, a better day, at least one that is more significant than, him being in captivity or him being a slave for a number of years. But yet, that's not how the story of Joseph ends. God exalts Joseph. God, gives Joseph a high position. Joseph even has his own kids. He has a family, and a wife, and God blesses him in many different ways, and then he also gets to see, his captors, his brothers dealt with, here on this earth. At least not from the standpoint of, maybe they were killed or, whipped or punished or in some way or something like that. But, at least in one kind of way of looking at it is Joseph sort of had the opportunity, in that, Joseph was in one point in the power of his brothers, but now, his brothers were in the power of Joseph, so that he could have thrown them into prison himself, or Joseph could have, had something bad happen to them. And even though the story says that Joseph didn't necessarily do that, he had at least, the opportunity to, render some sort of justice towards his brothers. And so, I think the story of Job, amongst many others, the story of Job shows how, Job was repaid here in this life for the things that he went through. The story of Ruth, Ruth, and really Naomi too. Ruth, her husband died. And we're not really told, much of that backstory or, what really involved that, but it really paints the picture of just the misfortune that happened in Ruth's life. And yet, and still, Ruth was repaid by being married to Boaz, by being, she didn't live the rest of her life as, maybe a homeless person or something, but she was remarried. She had her own kid, and, her son ended up being in the lineage of, Jesus Christ. And of course, King David as well. And so, we see, reference to how you can be repaid in this life, at least start to see some of your reward. But then, there's different stories like maybe Lazarus, who, was poor, and I think the story still kind of ties into how he was repaid, but yet and still Lazarus' story is kind of similar to Joseph and Ruth in a way of how the Bible is explaining how God repays someone. But in Lazarus' case, it didn't happen until he died and went into the next life. And so that is a little bit of an example, even though I'm sure, looking at maybe the character of God, there could have been some form of blessing that came to Lazarus during his life. But I know when Jesus tells the story, it doesn't necessarily paint that picture. It more paints the picture of, misfortune coming to Lazarus's life, and yet and still, God brought him into heaven and paradise. And so, when you look at the story of Jesus, you sort of see both in a way, if you kind of want to look at it like that, where you do see Jesus, suffering and dying on the cross, but yet and still you do see some sort of at least peaceful existence of Jesus while he was on this earth after he suffered and died. He seemed to have the Gospels go into some details about how Jesus, ministered to his disciples, and he showed himself that he was raised from the dead. And so in some form, you could almost say that Jesus, was sort of repaid here on this earth. But ultimately, we all know how Jesus rose into heaven and, is seated now at the right hand of God. And so, Jesus is, ultimately being repaid, and of course still, will be repaid in eternity. And so, there's probably more stories that we could think of, of how, there seems to be, a sort of a balance between, how God doesn't always have us experiencing, the worst life on this earth. But, he does sometimes, have us face different challenges. When you look at maybe some of the prophets, and, there's that passage in Hebrews that, talks about some of the hard things that people have faced here in this life. When you look at things that aren't mentioned in the Bible, the Jews being persecuted during the Holocaust. When you look at, what happened on October 7th, where, some of this stuff, obviously we don't necessarily know who exactly was a believer and who wasn't, but still, you can see there is, I know of a few stories at least of some people who did experience something of the Holocaust, and the persecution and suffering that they went through during the Holocaust, that they actually were believers in Jesus Christ. I think of Corrie ten Boom, and then, there's another person that I'm forgetting his name, but he was a doctor. He's a pretty famous person, at least within the Christian realm, and he went through the Holocaust. But I'm pretty sure that he was ended up being a Christian. And then obviously, before Jesus really came to this earth, there was sort of a different type of way of salvation, not totally different, but as far as naming the name of Jesus Christ, that's what we do, after Christ. But before Christ, they did not know the name of Jesus Christ. And so, I think when you talk about the Jews before Jesus, we don't really know exactly, if you go to maybe outside sources from the Bible, you don't know always who was, saved and who wasn't, because, it's kind of a different, way. But now, I think a lot of Jews, in Israel and throughout the world may not necessarily believe in Jesus. And so we know that, you have to believe in Jesus, regardless of if you're a Jew or a Gentile. You have to believe in Jesus in order to go to heaven. Otherwise, no matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, you will go to hell if you do not believe in Jesus. And so, these are things that, we can sort of think about. I know that there are some things that are obviously, some form of punishment in regards to rebellion against God. The Bible says to consider the goodness and the severity of God. And so sometimes, when you sometimes hear or maybe, see some of the crazy stuff that people are subject to, and to consider that, when they die, if they don't have faith in Jesus Christ, their suffering, will continue throughout all of eternity. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty, a heavy topic that I think is almost, kind of not understandable in some ways. And so, I think that, we have to be okay with how, God operates. And I think that definitely, there are things that we can do. I think sometimes, God may be looking for us to pray about a certain situation. God may be looking for us to change something that we're doing. There may be some form of wisdom that we need to get. I know that Jesus, when he asked the man, that was paralyzed, do you want to get well? Jesus did imply that there was, at least, you can see from Jesus's question that there was something that, Jesus was sort of expecting the man to kind of believe, that, Jesus was sort of asking him, does he want to get well, in a way of saying that maybe the man sort of gave up on trying to even get well, especially when, the Bible references the pool of Siloam. I think that was the same pool in the story, but there's a pool that if you went in there at a right time, you can be healed. And the Bible describes that story in such a way where it was actually true that if you did get into that water, you would have been healed. The Bible doesn't describe that story as just something that they believed, to be true, but it wasn't necessarily true. The Bible, tells that story in such a way that an angel really did, at least in Israel, an angel really did go to those waters and I guess touch the water or stir up the water in some way, that if you went in there during a certain time, and that story really shows how, kind of crazy Israel was, like in a cool way. But anyway, somehow maybe Jesus was sort of implying that, the man maybe could have gotten well, but, sort of gave up. I don't think Jesus was necessarily, coming from a rebuking standpoint, because sometimes, it is hard, to find motivation in life. But I think Jesus was definitely, teaching us teaching us a lesson. And so, going back to how, I think sometimes, to get blessings or something, that sometimes there does need to be things that we need to do. There are things that we need to do, maybe, but I think sometimes there are some situations that, may be beyond our sort of figuring out how to sort of get out of it. I mean, I don't know. When you look at maybe John the Baptist, John the Baptist was beheaded. From an outsider looking in, maybe you could say, oh, why did John the Baptist, rebuke the king? Was it necessary for him to point out that his wife, was, or the king shouldn't have had, his brother's wife? was that whole conversation necessary? I don't know. Some of those things, I think that, one, the Bible references John the Baptist as, one of the greatest prophets, outside of Jesus Christ himself, one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament, and so I think sometimes, there are some situations that, are, beyond maybe what we're capable of, not necessarily temptation or something, but maybe there are just some hard situations. So anyway, hopefully this podcast was helpful to someone. I think that, God lets us know that ultimately, in the end, it's going to work out for those who have faith in Jesus Christ. For those who have rejected Jesus Christ, I think we have to trust God that, God's ways are right, and, that decision is really on them, and it's not necessarily, a fault of God or something. And so, ultimately, it's going to work out. And I love that, we can trust God to bring us through situations. And, I think I really say this, from just, different things that I can think about, or, different things that maybe I have gone through already, or different things that, I may be thinking about as far as my future is concerned. And so, I think that, we have to have that trust in God, and, ultimately, try our best to, do things right. And of course, I know one time, I was driving with my dad, and, a car pulled out of nowhere, and, we got into a car wreck and totaled the car. And so, that was kind of a situation where, it wasn't necessarily something that we could, react to really that fast. But yet and still, thankfully, we weren't necessarily hurt, in a major way. But, I think it kind of goes to show that, sometimes, there are situations beyond our control, and I think we pray, to God to, help, control what we go through and stuff. When you look at the story of Job, the story of Job, even though we can kind of, think about, I know I have my own opinion about maybe Job didn't do this particular thing right. But, in a way, the story doesn't necessarily say, anything that Job did wrong. And yet, there was a whole situation brewing in heaven that was beyond, Job's control, and so, Job, made it through. But, anyway, thanks so much for checking out this podcast. Hopefully this was helpful to someone. And I will talk to you on the next one. See ya.